Will you still need me? Will you still feed me when I'm 64?
Hey everyone, it's Melissa. Today I am going to talk about turning 64. Thank you to my grandchildren for singing the introduction for me. It is the Paul McCartney or the Beatles song, When I'm 64. And so I taught it to them and they sang it for me, so I appreciate that. That song came out in 1967 when I was 12 years old, and I remember thinking, that song has always stuck with me all these years. I was 12 and I remember thinking, that is old, 64. I couldn't even imagine anybody ever being 64. My parents weren't even that old. Probably my grandparents, that was old. And then when Paul McCartney reached the age of 64, I thought, dang, Paul McCartney's old. And now I'm 64. And I woke up that morning and thought, after, thinking back on that little 12-year-old girl, thinking 64 was so old, and it was just unbelievable to me. And then this day that now I am 64, it was a little jarring. It made me think, I have to admit. But then I realized, I've seen a lot during my 64 years. There's been a lot of changes, a lot of things have happened. And so I thought that I would focus on 64 years of living rather than, and do a video on that rather than 64. So that's kind of what I'm going to do right now. I'm just going to go over the past 64 years, what I've seen, my perspective of it, and what, sort of our country has gone through and the changes that have taken place. And just sort of a bit of a reflection. I'm being a bit self-indulgent. I will admit that. I won't do it anymore after this one, but this one for this particular birthday, I thought I might be a little self-indulgent. So if you don't want to hear that, then you won't like this video. So I thought I would warn you. But I thought I would start off telling you where I was born and the different places that I lived, and then the different things that happened during that time across my country and across the world. I was born in Paducah, Kentucky, April 20th, 1955. My father was an engineer with TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. He had I don't think he had been on that job very long when I was born. My mother was 27. My father was about to turn 29. And I had an older brother already. I was the baby of the family and the only girl. Dwight D. Eisenhower was the President of the United States. Albert Einstein died that year, and I think I remember reading that someone stole his brain to study it and then returned it years later, like to his granddaughter or something, returned the brain to her. But yeah, his brain was stolen because a scientist wanted to study it. And also that year, Rosa Parks refused to sit in the back of the bus in Montgomery, Alabama. So, that was a profound effect of my generation. So when I was 2 years old, we moved, my father got transferred, and we moved to Camden, Tennessee, which is in West Tennessee. I lived there till I was 4. And then when I was 4, we moved to a little town called Jasper, Tennessee. It's in a little triangle area where Alabama, Georgia, and Tennessee meet there. It's sort of in some foothills, I guess, of the Cumberland Plateau. But we were kind of surrounded by mountains, and I lived there until my teenage years. So I lived there. We moved there when the end of the 50s in 1959. So I spent all of the 60s living there, which the 60s was a real interesting and life-changing, probably, generation or decade. So I thought I would talk about what my favorite TV shows were in the 60s. I liked Dark Shadows every afternoon when I get home from school. Although I was afraid of vampires, terrified of vampires because of that TV show, and I would sleep every night with a cross on my neck because I was so terrified of vampires. And when those fangs would come out, you know, they'd put those fake teeth on, I'd have to hide my eyes and everything. And I've always been kind of afraid of vampires. My favorite TV shows were The Dick Van Dyke Show, Bewitched, Andy Griffith, Batman. I remember I could play this theme song of Batman on my piano. Laugh In, loved that, loved all that. Goldie Hawn got her start there. The Monkees, oh, could we ever forget the TV show of this generation, the Monkees? I love them, and Mickey was my favorite. I had a thing sometimes for drummers. The Jackie Gleason show, I remember I would always watch it with my parents so I could see the June Tyler dancers, you know, because I always wanted to grow up and be a dancer. I always wanted to be like a June Tyler dancer, or I wanted to be a rockette and dance at Radio City Music Hall. And I've told you all plenty of times before, I used to practice my kicks all the time, but I always watched Jackie Gleason so I could see the June Tyler dancers. So those were a few of the shows that we watched during that time, during that decade. I was watching TV. I was homesick that day. It was November 22nd, 1963. I was watching TV, and I never will forget it. Like most of us will never forget it. The TV show was interrupted to say that President Kennedy had been shot. So I ran and, you know, told my mother. She was in the other room. I told my mother, and she ran in and she ran outside and got to the neighbors. It was like people wanted to be together. I remember that. And when my father came home from work, he hugged my mother, and they all kind of wanted to go outside. And so I would follow them outside. 63, I was 8 years old. So as an 8-year-old, I followed my parents outside and watched all this unfolding. I knew it was something extremely important, and it was. So over the next few days, we followed it. My uncle was a detective in Texas, in Dallas, so he was sort of, you know, we would talk to him on the phone and you know, was he okay? What was going on there? I remember my parents doing that. Another thing I remember, and this might be interesting, it was an international thing. Winston Churchill died, and his funeral was on our TV, on American TV. And my father had a little video camera, not video, it was, you know, one of those that you wind up. It was a film, you know, and you would have the film developed. But he took movies of the whole funeral on TV, and since it was coming across the TV waves, it was kind of like rolling a little bit and jumpy. But I've got whole footage in there of tape after tape after tape of Winston Churchill's funeral, because I think because my parents had lived, you know, they were World War II adults. My father had fought in it, and my mother, you know, all her brothers had and stuff. They were so involved in it that when this leader of the UK, you know, when he died, it was so profound to them. So I do have that footage, and that was kind of an interesting thing for me, or one that I never did forget. I always remember that too. Then on February the 9th, 1964, I had another huge thing happened to me. I knew it was going to happen. I sat down on that Sunday night and I watched the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. Boy, did that ever change my way of thinking. It changed my way of thinking about boys, about the way boys looked, about music, about guitarists, about drummers, about rock groups. It was the start of so much enjoyment for me, and so much tragedy of my teenage years. You know how, you know, music, you know, I would sit, and when a boy would break up with me, play you know, sad rock music, or, you know, and I was happy and danced, you know. It was just the start. That night was the beginning of so many emotions and so many things of that era. You know, Woodstock and just, you know, all kinds of groups. They all began or started, to me, in my mind, with the Beatles on that Ed Sullivan Show. Of course, they had already been big in Europe and in the UK, but this was the first time I had been exposed to them. And it was very, very profound. It changed style. It changed everything for my generation. We were enthralled with the Fab Four, just enthralled with them. I also remember the 60s as being a fearful time. President Kennedy was assassinated, Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated, and Robert Kennedy was assassinated. Those really affected us, I think. The Cold War, I think, had a very, very profound effect on us. We were taught as children to duck and cover, to get under our desks, because when or if the nuclear attack happened, then, we had to protect ourselves by getting under our desks. People were encouraged to build fallout shelters. I remember my aunt and uncle that I just loved and was really, really close to, and Doug remembers this too, because his grandparents lived in Oak Ridge, where the nuclear bomb, a lot of it had been developed in Oak Ridge. So the people were in Oak Ridge during that time. I remember I would go down to my aunt and uncle's shelter and see all the food that they had gathered, the tin cans, and thinking, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to all of us? I mean, just really like wringing my hands. What is going to become of all of us? We're all going to be blown up. We're all going to be melted. We were a generation of being fearful as children, I think. And I really was living so close we lived close to Oak Ridge, and my beloved aunt and uncle and cousin lived in Oak Ridge, and they were going to be a direct hit anytime. I just didn't know when it was going to happen or if. So that was profound. I think on all of us, or it was on me, given the area I lived in and given the people that I loved that lived in Oak Ridge. When I was 14 years old, my father got transferred, so we moved to Murray, Kentucky. It's up in western Kentucky, and I lived there till I graduated from high school 4 years later. I was your typical teenager, go to school, have friends, think of boys, wish boys would ask me out, wish, do I look right? And it was a wonderful time. This was 1969 till I graduated from high school in 1973. So late 60s, early 70s. It was a college town that I lived in, and so I met and started dating someone that was in college. And then when I started my senior year in high school, things were bad at home, and so I eloped, ran away and got married, and then spent my senior year as a married woman. And then when I graduated from high school, we moved to Lexington, Kentucky, so he can continue to go to college there. I went to a brief business college, and then I started working for a TV station in Lexington, Channel 27, WKYT TV. I worked in the sales department as the sales secretary, so I typed up all their stuff for them and typed up all their letters and all the stuff that, helped them to contact advertisers and stuff for the TV station. I got to meet a lot of famous people. It was a lot of fun. A lot of people would come in for the horse season in Lexington, Kentucky, to watch the races at Keeneland, and they would come to the TV station to film things, to do little promos and stuff like that. So I did have the opportunity to meet a lot of those people, which was a lot of fun. Then I got pregnant with my first child, and my husband got hired with TVA, so we moved to Middle Tennessee. Lived there for a few years, and my second child was born there. Then we moved to East Tennessee, where I lived there. Unfortunately, ended up divorced. Started working for Doug. He and I got married in 1986 and have been together since. My children graduated from high school in the town we lived in. They both went away to college and did their own thing and ended up coming back here. And in fact, they both live on the street we live on. I ended up with 7 grandchildren, even though I only have 2 children. My son has 4, my daughter has 3. I've mentioned this on video that I did pretty recently. Here's my observations. I think between my parents' generation and my generation, there was a divide there. I can remember, and I know a lot of people felt that way, we didn't particularly want to live close to our parents. I'm sure there were tons and tons of exceptions, but it seemed to be a generation that rejected a lot of the ideals and ideas that our parents had, the baby boomers. We were disillusioned. I'm sure it was all of the things that happened in the 60s and maybe in the early 70s. Maybe it was disco. I don't know. We lived through disco too. I think I saw Saturday Night Fever about 15 times. I just loved that movie and I danced along. I learned all the moves and everything. I even took hustle lessons. So I enjoyed that. But I think I see the divide that my generation possibly had. Like I said, they're not always, but just the culture and the rebellion, and I'm going to go to San Francisco and I'm going to reject everything and I'm going to protest the war in Vietnam, and the war in Vietnam was very profound on all of us. I had the boy that I was dating, that was in college, they were doing the lottery then, and his number, we were watching to make sure his number didn't come up high where he would be drafted. My brother actually got drafted. The war, oh gosh, it really affected all of us. So I think the war, all the different things had created a bit of a divide between my generation and our parents on a lot of people. And caused a lot of protest, a lot of rejection of their ideals. I don't see that as much with my children and my generation. I think they seem to like us. They seem to want to come back and be around us. And my daughter-in-law's parents are retiring, and they're looking at a place next door to me, which is across the street from them. And my daughter's right down the street. So I think that this has, I think maybe the generations are coming back together again and realizing, like the saying goes, it takes a village to raise a child. I think we're pulling together more as families the way that maybe our grandparents did in generations before that. I think that there was this blip in this generation, the generation that I'm in, that we kind of separated and now we're coming and circling back together again. I think that happens a lot, I think we're starting to do that again. So anyway, I was trying to think if there was anything else. I really appreciate it. If I find some interesting pictures, I will show it. Thank you for watching this. Those of you that did, if you stuck around with me this long, I don't know how long it's going to be. I just felt a need to reflect back a little bit, and then I'll get back to makeup and hair and all that kind of stuff. But sometimes I just like to reflect. I just do. So thank you so much for watching. I am so very, very grateful. I'm meeting Kristen tomorrow. We'll have a video for you coming up soon. We'll have a car chat. And anyway, have a wonderful rest of the week, and I'll talk to you in a few days. Bye-bye.